Tim asked me to speak as an introduction to MMT. I'm one of the founders of MMT. It goes back to about the mid-90s. And then to use that understanding to talk about job guarantee. So that's the agenda. And given that I've had a career as a teacher, I know that after 45 minutes people typically turn off. And I now know from relentless use of this online teaching type technologies that the turn-off period is considerably shorter. And so I'm going to try to get through a fair bit in about 30 minutes. We'll see how we go. So the first thing to realise is that when you first understand about MMT, I liken it to when we were young and learning a language. It's an educative process, and just like when we started to learn to speak and learn syntax and learning to be literate, it took us a long time. And MMT it takes a long time to learn. And that's one of because of the cognition that's needed, but B, because it's being introduced to people in a world of cognitive dissonance. It creates a lot of dissonance for people because they've been either explicitly or implicitly conditioned to think about economics and money and government, fiscal and monetary policy in a particular way. And so when they come out, they're confronted by MMT, it just scatters their brains. And so it's a slow burn, and we can't get anywhere near it in 30 minutes. The other thing is that I'll introduce you to a couple of simple heuristics, and be warned or understand that simple heuristics are simple and they're abstractions from the real world, and they may not exactly be true in the real world once we add institutional layers and complexity, but they guide us to truth or understanding. The other thing to understand is that social media doesn't make anybody an expert. And what I mean by that is that MMT is everywhere now. If you look at Google, go into Google Trends and type in modern monetary theory, the graph's going up like the COVID virus in the US. And everybody appears to think that because they've got a Twitter account or a Facebook account that they've become experts overnight in MMT. And there's incredible amount of misinformation and misunderstanding, even of those who are sympathetic. And that feeds into journalists writing stupid articles, even though they're sympathetic and wanting to portray it out. And a few weeks ago, Alan Kohler had an article in The Australian, and we had interchange about it. And then I did quite a long podcast, and it's an interesting podcast. It's his best podcast ever, he says. But you can see the process by which a mainstream financial commentator who's got a national scope, ABC News finance report, you can see through that podcast the way in which the dissonance is slowly evolving and diminishing as we talk in a very reasoned, slow way. MMT, what isn't it? Well, it's got nothing to do. It's not cultural studies. It's not history. It's not law. It's macroeconomics. And while most of us have never studied macroeconomics and think of it as rather boring, and of course it probably is relative to cinema studies and what have you, that's what it is. It's macro. And there's a whole body of work being done by people in other social sciences and humanities on top of the work we've done in the pure macro and monetary theory, and that in law and in communications and in language and so on and so forth. But that's not MMT. The second thing that's really important to understand, and this is a common flaw, people who criticise us say things like, if we ever have MMT, all hell on earth will break loose. And progressives say, God, I wish we had MMT. It's the solution. Well, it's implying that MMT is somehow a regime that we're going to shift to. And the point I make always at these sort of introductory talks is MMT is what's out there now. We've already got it. It's a lens to see the monetary system that we have and the way in which the monetary system operates. And like any lens, I've got a lens here, and I can see a couple of people in the audience have too. It allows us much more clarity of sight, and we see things with lenses that we can't see without them. And if we've got the wrong lenses, we get skewed versions of what the reality is. And so lenses, MMT is a framework for understanding the way the system we have, the fiat currency system. And what I mean by that is that in 1971, most nations moved to fiat currencies, where their money and the currency was not backed by any valuable thing like commodity, like silver or gold, but was just introduced as a legislative fiat of government. And it has no intrinsic value. And so we'll learn in a minute what gives it value. And so what that lens allows us to do is understand the capacities of the government within who issues the currency, and what the constraints on those of us who use the currency are, in a much more clear way. And it exposes what I call the veil of ideology. Because when you hear government officials and prime ministers out there saying, oh, we haven't got enough money to do this or that, then if you have an MMT understanding, you know that's not true, and I'll come to that later. Now, the other point to understand is that MMT is ambivalent about ideology. It's neither right-wing or left-wing in a crude sense. And it has no policy. It's a lens. And to operationalise the policy, you need to layer that understanding that you get of the monetary system with an ideology or a set of values. Now, I happen to be on the left, fairly far out, and my understanding of MMT that I've helped develop gives me a totally different policy set, emphasising collectivism, solidarity, helping the poor, public goods, full employment, and good foreign aid, and all of the things that you'd expect from a progressive person. But a person on the right could have exactly the same understanding as me, and the value layer they then impose will give a totally different policy set. We both have intrinsic understandings, MMT understandings through the lens, but our policy sets are totally different. And so we're not going to move to MMT. It's not a new regime. It's not something that's it's out there now, and it gives us an understanding of what the capacities of our currency issuing government and its institutions, the central bank and treasury, are, and what the consequences of them doing A or B or C will be, more or less. So that's really important. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about all of these things. This is MMT. It has a number of narratives that go together to discuss, to build up that understanding or that framework, a money story, a banking story, a resource story, a trade story, and so on and so forth. And what I'll talk about tonight is a bit about the money story, because that's where you start. And then we'll move down vertically and end up at the stability framework story, because that's the job guarantee. All right. What does it mean that the Australian government has its own currency? What do we understand by that? And what we understand is that, contrary to everything you've been told, there is no intrinsic financial constraint on the Australian government. It's a currency issuer. It's the only institution that issues the Australian dollar, the currency, and we use it, it issues it. And what that means is that it can intrinsically buy, and why I say intrinsic, because we know in the real world that we layer a whole stack of voluntary constraints on government that overrules that freedom of having no financial constraints. So all these accounting structures that money's got to go in and out of, and all of the ideological stuff that you can't have too much debt, and all of the other stuff that is the characteristic of conservatism and neoliberalism. But underneath all of that ideology and administrative and institutional detail is no financial constraint. And at times of crisis, we learn that very quickly. And what that means is that the government can buy anything for sale in its own currency, including all labour that's idle, which means that you've already got a new conclusion that maybe you didn't have before. That is that when there's mass unemployment, that's a policy choice of government. It's not a financial constraint, because if the government wanted to eliminate unemployment, it could buy up all the labour itself. It has no financial constraint to do that. Now, what it doesn't mean is that the government can buy unlimited quantities of goods and services without consequence, and we'll see what that means in a moment. It also doesn't mean that if you're in a nation that is materially poor, like many African nations, and I've done a lot of work in Africa over the years, or in Central Asia where I've worked, it doesn't mean that those countries, if they have their own currency, will be materially rich. And we'll learn what that means. And it also doesn't mean printing money. So let's look at this. This is where we start. This is called the provisioning challenge. So on the non-government sector is us. We own all the goods, all the productive resources, labour, and you can see here all these things, capital, bits of capital, buildings, transport systems. They're mostly owned by us. And the challenge of government...
Sorry to interrupt, but I'm not certain that the slides are progressing. If that, are you...
What are you on at the moment?
I'm just seeing a screen with the first slide. It's not actually showing the slide, and then pages 1 through 10 on the left-hand side. Tim, what are you seeing? Is it any different?
Now it's come to the provisioning challenge across the top.
Okay, good. Yes. Thank you.
Found the magic button.
There was a little magic button here, yes, and we've got it now. Okay, so I've got it back. So the challenge for a government, which with its own currency, is to move all of these things into the public sector so that it can do things like deliver services and build infrastructure and provide law and order and all those things. Now the question is, how does it do that? If we own all those things, how does it get us to give them up, the use of those, and move them into the public sector? That's the fundamental problem facing government. And the way it does it, and what the government has that we don't have is its currency. It's the monopoly issuer. So how does the government use its currency to get us to transfer all of those productive resources into the government sector? And this little schematic gives you the clue. And this is a really rich schematic because it has a lot of implications. So initially it says to people, okay, we've got this, and we've done a lot of work in the way in which colonialists went into Africa and Latin America and usurped the local market systems with their own currencies and forced and got people to use their own currencies, the colonialist currency. So first of all, the Australian government says to us that you have to deliver X Australian dollars each month to us in form of a tax liability. And what problem does that give us? Well, the problem that gives us is that we don't have the currency yet to pay the taxes. And so where do we get it from? Well, the government has to spend it into existence. And so we're willing to sell the government our productive resources. In other words, accept government spending and procurement contracts and all the rest of it, because that gives us the currency which we can then pay our taxes here. So that gives a clue that, and if I studied philosophy, and Logic 101 was one of the early units, and Logic 101 says something that causes something has to come before rather than after. So if you understand this, it's the tax payments can't possibly fund the spending, because the tax payments can't be made until the currency has been spent into existence. Okay, now if we add a lot of institutional detail on that, then it gets blurred. But this is a simple heuristic. So here's an example. Now on the top here, we've got flows, and that's flows of currency. And on the bottom, we've got balance sheets, and that'll become apparent very soon. So all this requires is a little bit of arithmetic. So the government in year one decides to hire $100 worth of labour from the non-government sector. And so it spends $100 into existence, and income in the non-government sector jumps up by 100. And that's in the form of wage payments. So you've got the transfer occurring. The non-government sector is willing to do that. Why? Because they can now pay a $100 tax liability that they knew they had to pay at the end of the year, and they could only pay that if the government spent that $100 into existence. So at the end of year one, this is the causality. Spending into existence gives the income to the non-government sector. The non-government sector has now the currency in its hands. It can then pay the taxes. Now, at the end of the year, the non-government sector hasn't been able to accumulate any savings from these flows in the currency, and the government's fiscal injection, which I use that term rather than deficit or surplus because they're loaded terms, the fiscal position of the government is balanced. And so think about what you've just learnt in that blue rectangle, that if the government fiscal position is balanced, there can be no overall saving in that year in the non-government sector. And there's no financial wealth, balance sheet implications, and there's currently no debt. Let's go to year two. The government wants to pursue a green transition and wants to expand the public sector involvement in the economy. And as a consequence, it hires more workers. Employment goes up, unemployment falls. The income in the non-government sector now rises by 20. The tax liability has to be still 100. And so you get the causality. The income flow from the spending gives the non-government sector income which it can then pay taxes. And then in this case, it can save because it only has to pay the government back 100 and it got income of 120. So at the end, those flows then lead to a balance of flow of 20 plus for that, and the fiscal injection is 20. Now, this is the terminology. If we were looking at Australian government accounts, that would be a budget deficit of minus 20. But it's an injection, so the proper concept is the government is injecting a net $20 into the monetary system. And that's allowing, once all the taxes and work has been done, that's allowing the non-government sector to accumulate in its balance sheet here $20 in cash. That's its wealth. So this is its financial wealth. And so what do you learn from that? That dollar for dollar, the accumulation of financial wealth in the currency of issue is a reflection of the accumulation of deficits that the government spent. Let's go to year three. We have the same scenario. Once again, I'll just go back there. Once again, the net flow to the non-government sector is an additional 20 in accumulated currency, another deficit of 20, which is way I think about it is an injection, and now the non-government sector has 40 in their balance sheet. Two years of saving $20. Now, the government might then say that, oh, well, we'll swap that cash, which earns zero interest, for for an interest-earning government bond, if they wanted to encourage frugality or future risk management or building up of wealth with returns, whatever. And so they offer a bond, let's say it's they offer to sell a government debt instrument, 10% interest, let's say, and everybody in the non-government sector swaps their cash, in this case, for the interest-bearing asset. We're assuming away that they need short-term liquidity. And so what do you understand from that? You understand that this is national debt. And what do you understand by that? You understand that that national debt has not funded the spending, the deficits. The national debt is an expression, and I'll say this slowly, is an expression of past deficits that haven't yet been taxed away. That's what's happened here. That the 2 years of accumulating wealth of 40 has given, that's come from 2 years of deficits of 20, has given the non-government sector the financial wealth that they've then been able to buy $40 worth of government debt. The debt didn't fund this spending. It's just a portfolio choice of the non-government sector using wealth that has been accumulated by past deficits. So in effect, the government is really borrowing back deficits that they've spent in previous or current periods. Okay, so now we get the IMF involved, and everyone's telling this government that it's going to go broke, that it won't be able to fund its liabilities, which are now 40, et cetera, et cetera. And so in year 4, we've had this neoliberal austerity mindset, and look what happens. The government decides to cut back employment and only spend 80. Wages are now 76, and this 4 is the interest payments on the 40 outstanding debt liabilities from last year at 10%. And so what do we know? Well, we know that government employment's fallen, the unemployment rate will have risen, other things equal. Income in the non-government sector is now 80, in the form of $76 worth of employment income and $4 on the wealth that they held. Taxes haven't changed. The overall liability is still 100. And so what you've got here is now a liquidity screw. In jargon, this is fiscal drag, the government taking out more out of the economy than it's putting in. That's what we call fiscal drag. And that creates a liquidity squeeze on the non-government sector. Now ask yourself, where does the non-government sector get the $20 that it has to pay that it didn't earn that period to pay the taxes? It has to run down its saving. So in year 4, savings is negative 20, and it has to sell some bonds back to get the liquidity to fund that deficit. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, the government has run a surplus. The austerity plan was to run a surplus, get the debt down, and so the surplus is a negative 20 injection, and the national debt's fallen. So I can see most people here are old enough to remember Peter Costello's crowing as he was paying down the debt. And he was saying, we're getting the debt monkey off the Australian people's backs. Well, what he was doing was destroying, by running surpluses, he was destroying financial wealth in the non-government sector. He was putting a liquidity squeeze on us, which then forced us to get cash by liquidating our wealth to meet the squeeze that the government sector was putting on the non-government sector liquidity. And he was also, next period, the interest payments will only be 2 rather than 4 because there's only $20 worth of debt, which means that not only was he destroying our wealth, and whenever governments run surpluses, that's what they're doing, but they are also destroying income flow into the non-government sector in the form of interest payments. Okay, so what have we learnt there? And you know, obviously, I could go on and drive the non-government sector into bankruptcy, and that's what surpluses do. They, you know, we've abstracted from distributional issues here, but that's what they do. They eventually drive people into bankruptcy. Employment falls, unemployment rises, the liquidity squeeze gets to the point where people can't liquidate wealth anymore and they declare bankruptcy, and then that multiplies through. That's the impact of surpluses typically. So what have we learned? Taxes don't fund government spending. Public debt doesn't fund government spending. The government can't run out of money. It's sort of like saying that, and I'm a Melbourne sort of character, so it's like saying that halfway through the second quarter at the MCG, the scoreboard announces the game's got to stop because it's run out of points. That's sort of as stupid as saying that a government that issues its own currency can ever run out of money. And but fiscal deficits generate income and saving in the non-government sector. Surpluses destroy our wealth, and the only issue that I didn't come to is that the government can, while it can't run out of money, it can exhaust real resources. So let's quickly turn to that. This is the inflation story. And when we talk about inflation in the public debate, we typically concentrate always on government spending, and we focus on the inflation risk of deficits, and mainstream economists are continually talking about the inflation risk of deficits. Well, the reality is that all spending carries an inflation risk, whether it be export revenue, household consumption spending, business investment in productive capacity, or government spending. It's all carries an inflation risk. And the inflation risk is that the growth in nominal spending, so that's the dollars that are being pumped into the economy by all those different sources of spending, the inflation risk is that that spending growth will outstrip the real capacity of the economy to respond to that spending by producing goods and services for sale. And so if we reach full capacity and we keep having growth in nominal spending above that capacity, then you'll get inflation. So the balancing act for government is to make sure it maintains spending sufficient growth rate once the non-government sector has made its decisions, spending and saving decisions, so that the growth in spending is at the level that pushes up to full capacity and not beyond. In other words, maintains full employment but doesn't push beyond that. The other point about it is that we have this obsession about printing money. And you can see it now. They're talking about, oh, this must mean, MMT must mean printing money. Well, the reality is that every hour of most days, the government is spending. And how does it initiate spending? Well, depending on the institutional structure of the nation, the Treasury or the Finance Ministry or Department instructs the central bank to type some numbers into bank accounts on its behalf. And as soon as those bank numbers are typed in, that's spent. That's how governments spend. And at the moment, we're typing lots of zeros in, but it doesn't alter the way. So there's no printing money involved. All government spending occurs in the same way. So the next important question is, well, then, if inflation risk is about real resource constraints, how do we appraise those constraints on spending? So here's a little framework. And there's these two dimensions. One is, does the nation enjoy monetary sovereignty? What does that mean? It means that it issues its own currency and it's in monopoly. It floats it on foreign exchange markets like the Australian dollar. It sets its own interest rate through its central bank. Remember, the central bank is part of government, and it doesn't borrow in any foreign currency. So Australia is a sovereign country, Germany isn't. All of the 19 European economic and monetary union countries use a foreign currency, the euro. But Australia is, like most countries, sovereign. The other dimension is the economy currently using all of its productive resources or not? So let's take that case. Well, what are the constraints on government spending in this situation? The constraints are real. What does that mean? It means that there's no financial constraint on governments. Governments can just keep pumping up spending till the cows come home, this sort of government. But what it comes up against, if we're all fully employed, is a real resource constraint, because if it keeps trying to bid for the resources that are already currently being fully used, then it bids up their price, and that's where you get an inflationary impulse. And so in this particular option, and you'll learn something very important, I hope, is that what the government has to do in this case, if it wants to expand its use of productive resources, in other words, increase the size of government, and this is going to become a particularly important issue when we get to green transition type situations in hopefully soon, where the government's going to have to increase its size and use of productive resources. And what it has to do in this case is deprive the existing users of those resource use. If they're already being used and the government wants to use more of them, well, then it has to deprive the users who are currently using them, us. Now, how does it do that? There's a number of different ways, but a principal way is through taxation. Because what taxation does is reduces our purchasing power, and it reduces our ability to command real resources. And in that context, you can now see that taxes are essential in a modern monetary story, but they're not to fund the spending. They're to create the real resource base that's necessary for governments to increase spending without causing inflation. Okay, let's go to this case. Here we've got mass unemployment. The Australian government's confronting the current situation, which is a disaster. What constraints has it got? Zero. It doesn't have any financial constraints, and it doesn't have any resource constraints, because there's all these idle resources that are not in productive use. And so in this point, the deficit should just keep rising until you get back to that point. And so any productive resources that are idle are a policy choice of government, not a financial constraint at all. So at the moment, you can think about the Treasury is saying that the JobKeeper wage subsidy is saving us from 15% unemployment, and the unemployment rate's likely to rise to 10%. Well, it's already done that. Well, how do you appraise that in this story? Well, you immediately know that if unemployment's risen from 5 to 10, but it would have gone to 15, well, then the JobKeeper hasn't done its job properly. They've stinted on the injection, and the injection's probably half as much as what's needed. Now, in these cases, and I'll skip through this, where a government is like Germany or France or Italy, well, then they've both got financial and real constraints in that situation. They've not only got the problem they're up against the inflation barrier, but they've also got the problem that they don't issue their own currency. They've got to borrow and tax, and so they've got financial constraints as well. And that remains in this situation. All right, so I'm going to skip a couple of slides in the interest of time and talk briefly, maybe for 10 minutes, about buffer stock options. Now, this is part of the inflation story, and then moving into how do we maintain price stability and full employment. Now, any currency issuing government has two options to stabilise prices, which means to keep stable inflation. One is an unemployment buffer stock, and a buffer stock is just a stock of something that goes up and down with the cycle. And so we call this is the orthodoxy. It's called the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment approach. Now, this isn't the right audience to go into the depths of that, but the simple way of understanding that is that the government previously, up till about the mid-70s, used unemployment as a policy target. And I was brought up in an environment where if the government allowed unemployment to go above 2%, they lost office next election, or they were in serious trouble. And so they did everything they could to stop mass unemployment occurring. Now, under neoliberalism, unemployment's become a policy tool, not a policy target. And the target is low inflation, and they use unemployment to discipline the inflation process such that they force unemployment up when there's inflationary pressures. That's an unemployment buffer stock approach. The alternative is to use employment buffer stocks. Now, what this means is, and we call it in MMT a job guarantee, and I got this idea in 1978 when I was a student at Melbourne University, that and I was studying agricultural economics and studying the wool price stabilisation scheme. And this was a scheme that the federal government ran that to aim to stabilise the incomes of the farm lobby, the wool farmers. And what they agreed was that each wool clip, as it came into the market, if there was a shortage of, if there was an excess of wool, so the season was good, the government, which would typically drive the price of wool down in the market because there'd be an excess relative to demand, the government agreed to buy it all, the excess, to stabilise at the agreed price. And if you remember all those old red brick warehouses in our cities, well, they were wool stores where the government used to put its wool. And if the clip was bad one season, if the market, the farmers didn't deliver enough wool into the market, well, then that would typically drive the price up. And the government in those circumstances agreed that they would sell wool back into the market to absorb the excess demand given the poor clip, and that would stabilise the prices. Now, if you think about that, and I did think about that as a student at Melbourne University, because that was at the time I was studying at the time when Malcolm Fraser was driving unemployment up in the late 1970s. And I wasn't very interested in wool, but I saw it as a way in which the government could do so the wool was a buffer stock, in other words, went up and down with the cycle. But I saw that they could use jobs as a buffer stock. And if the private spending cycle was deficient, then the government could offer an unconditional job offer to anybody who wanted one, absorb it as an increased employment buffer, and then when the private market regained strength, the private employers would just buy the labour out of the job guarantee back into the non-government sector. That's the job guarantee. Let's go on. And the reason why in MMT, and go back to the first slide, I said that there is no policy in MMT. Now, a lot of people get confused because we advocate a job guarantee. But why it's more than a policy, and it goes back to this point about efficiency, that one of the basic principles of economics is you don't want to be wasting resources. And so you want to choose frameworks that minimise waste of resources. Now, the problem with the unemployment buffer stock approach, which we've seen used over the last 30 years, it's incredibly wasteful and damaging. Not only in daily lost income, we sacrifice millions of dollars of lost output and therefore lost income to the non-government sector, but we also then invoke a whole series of pathologies, family breakdown, increased alcohol substance abuse, increased crime rates, mental illness, social dislocation, community breakdown, and all the rest of it. Intergenerational disadvantage. If you grow up in a jobless household, especially a long-term jobless household, you're very likely going to inherit that disadvantage and have an unstable job history yourself, and all these massive costs. And so what we thought at the time when we started working on this in the 90s was that the unemployment buffer stock couldn't possibly be a superior outcome to maintain price stability, which is a desirable feature of a macroeconomy. And even though the employment buffer stock system isn't perfect, it's far superior. So what it is, the national government tomorrow comes out, ScoMo comes out and says, forget unemployment benefits. Anybody who wants a job at a socially inclusive minimum wage, and the social inclusive is important because the social inclusive means that you can participate in society without being impoverished by unemployment benefits. In other words, you can go to cinema or go to the sports and go out to dinner occasionally and have a holiday and stuff like that, and enjoy childcare and facilities and stuff. So ScoMo says anybody who wants a job at socially inclusive minimum wage, turn up to Centrelink, and you'll notice the Centrelink doesn't have the name anymore. It's Job Guarantee Office. And that's what the job guarantee is. It's unconditional. You can take 10 hours work, 20, 30, 40. It's not a program like workfare. We're forced to do it. Essentially, it can't possibly be inflationary because you're hiring off the bottom. What does that mean? If you think about the unemployed, they've got what we call in jargon zero bid in the market. What does that mean? It means nobody wants to hire them. And so they've got no bid. Nobody wants them. So if the government just offers, the important point about the social inclusive minimum wage is that you're buying at the bottom of the wage structure. You're not competing with the non-government sector for resources that they also want. You're buying it off the bottom. And that provides us with a very high quality inflation anchor. And the way you think about that is that when the private sector is inflating, which we haven't seen for many years, the way in which we deal with that now is to create unemployment. We use unemployment as a policy tool. We increase the buffer stock of unemployment. Under a job guarantee, the government would still have contractionary, in that instance where there's an inflationary spiral, would still introduce contractionary policies to deflate the economy. But instead of causing unemployment, it would transfer those resources temporarily into the job guarantee pool. And so it's not perfect, obviously, but it's better than forcing people into unemployed, because people who remain in touch with their workplace maintain most of their work skills. Whereas if you become unemployed, you very quickly start the process of attrition of skills. And so you've got all these benefits. It's hiring costs of businesses are cheaper, InterGeneration. I was at a seminar when I was a young academic, and it was an American economist who was at the Brookings Institute. And he said that he was talking about job creation programs, public sector job creation in general. And he said one of the striking results of their study, they'd done cohort studies, was that children who saw their parents go to work every day developed very stable work histories later on in life, whereas children who saw their parents wallowing in unemployment and all of the agony and anguish and dislocation and alienation that engenders also inherited those disadvantages once they moved into adult life. So you get incredible intergenerational advantages. Job guarantee can be ultimately flexible, training, career paths. We've done some very innovative work with mental health researchers in New South Wales we were looking at youth with episodic illnesses, so schizophrenia. And they tend to have very dislocated school to work transitions because the illness hits around the late teens typically, and so they end up on the scrap heap, and they never really do anything. And what we did, we ran pilots where and private sector won't employ those people very easily. because they're unreliable at certain times in the episodes. And we did this really interesting work with the health service, mental health service, where we set up pilot employment programs for these youth that are typically incredibly disadvantaged. And what we found was that in flexible work environments where clinical support was given as well as job-specific training, etc., even though the kids had episodes because they were ill, they had become very productive in the times that they were clear. And what the research evidence shows very strongly is if you intervene early into mental health issues, you can create stable transitions into work from education rather than just abandon the kids. And also, by the time they're in their 30s, their symptoms are declining. Really important result. And so the job guarantee, the private sector employers, we tried to get private sector employers to take these people on. They wouldn't go near it. But a job guarantee scheme could employ all of these people and become very productive. And you talk to them when they're clear, they're have incredible rise in their self-esteem from when we first interviewed them because they were working, they were being part of something. The job guarantee can support environmental sustainability. It's not a panacea. It's not the only thing government should do, and it typically should be a very small buffer stock, but it's better than what we've got. So the other couple more points before I hand it over is that, in my view, and this relates to discussions about UBI, basic income guarantees. In my view, the culture of Australia and most Western countries is still a paid work culture. We still value people by their attachment to employment, what they do, whether they're contributing through their employment. And we still have a reluctance to accept people who don't work who can. So that's a cultural issue which may change, but that's where we're at. Now, my view is that, and within that environment, we also have a view about productivity. That productivity is somehow related to whether you contribute to private profit or not. And we talk about make work schemes and all of this if we're going to have public sector job creation, as if it's not productive. And what I say is that when I go to the supermarket, I'm a public employee. Obviously, I work in a university, a public university. And I've never been asked by a checkout operator whether I've got a real job or not, whether I've got a make work job or not. They want the money. And so the way I think about the job guarantee is that it actually provides social change is very slow moving. It requires education reinforced with public messaging and all the rest of it. And what the job guarantee can provide is a framework where we can alter what we mean by productive work and productive contribution. And so we can create jobs that stretch the limit and show society that these jobs are typically what we wouldn't value now, but produce valuable outputs. So, for example, I'm a surfer and I live just near the beaches just up the road, a couple of minutes away. And in summer, down the East Coast, there's a huge problem of drowning and water safety. And when we go out to the surfing, we jump in the most dangerous parts of the beach because they're the rips that take us out quicker. So surfers have innate knowledge of water and water safety. So why not have surfers in the job guarantee? What would they do? They could go surfing. But what else would they do? They could take school classes teaching school classes during the winter or the summer on the beach and teach children to understand water safety and where to go in and what's going to happen if you go there, there and there. And the other thing I think about is the arts community, which is absolutely devastated now. It's shrunk dramatically in the last 2 weeks. And I play in a band, as Tim said in the beginning. And we've had all of our gigs cancelled. And lucky I don't rely on that for income anymore. But we could employ all the bands, all the artists. What would they do? Play guitars. What else would they do? They could go to schools and have rehearsals in schools, or teach children how to write music and composition and about stringing guitars and X, Y, Z. Now, those contributions are highly productive in a social sense and would push us further along the road to changing our whole conception of contribution to society, what's valuable and what's not, and so on and so forth. So I see the job guarantee. And over the years, I've been criticised heavily by Marxists for creating a palliative to sustain capitalism. But I also see it as being a radical framework for undermining capitalism in the long run when society's ready for it. Last points. What about...
Sorry, Bill, I was just going to say, maybe we'll try and keep people along for a little bit more questions, but maybe wrap it up sort of on this
Okay,
one.
so I won't talk about basic income at all.
Mm-hmm.
The conclusion then, I'm against basic income. The reasons I'm against it are it's a neoliberal plot. It absolves the government of any responsibility for reducing unemployment, which we now know can reduce unemployment's a policy choice. It's individualistic. It's not a collective paradigm. It's just I want to do my art while everybody else works for you to produce your food, etc. It has no inflation risk, no inflation anchor. And so if there's inflationary pressures, unemployment's the solution. And it creates a conception of individuals as consuming agents purely, that there's no concept of the social value of work. So I'll leave it there because that's the last point.